won't spend too long talking about the damages because I do think that we know them. But obviously land fragmentation is a massive one. Animals and natural processes need a lot of space to move and to flow. So there's a correlation between every time you build a new road, biodiversity loss increases because the animals can't cross, but also it allows stores and houses. So if you watch these time-lapse videos of roads being put into the Amazon, for example, maybe for tourism, but it's still destroying that area of biodiversity. Invasive species is huge, and I think we need to be really careful about these flows of travel. Water usage, all these things we know. I think it's quite interesting to talk about the positive and the nature-based solution side. So there's this 30 by 30 agreement that maybe some of you know about, right? Let's protect 30% of oceans and land by 2030. There's a role for the tourism sector. If you imagine that there's like these protected areas that now it's not like fortress conservation where you fence it off and no human goes in because that's not socially just or equitable. So I think that tourism has a role to create kind of these buffer zones where you are offering a bioeconomy or a sustainable livelihood. Ecotourism is one version, but there's many versions where those communities aren't forced to go into the land and cut down for resources or cut down for food. So I think that's a massive potential. There's a really interesting one as well, which is we need a lot more biodiversity data, and one of the best ways is to collect it from the ground. So there are a lot of really interesting initiatives that are now using guests to be like wildlife trackers or to go and connect eDNA, environmental DNA, which is a super interesting development where you basically swab the water and you can tell who's there. So using destinations as a place for the citizen science, I think is really interesting. What else did I write down? Obviously sustainable food and value chains. You're in a destination where you're eating something that was flown from miles away. So I think the opportunity that destinations have to educate their clients on where their food is coming from in those chains is super interesting. And obviously connecting people with nature. There's kind of three ways you touched on them, right? One is baseline, right? So if you do want to implement these solutions, how do you baseline? Our tools are some ways, but there's many ways. And then you monitor the change over time, but you have to set a goal. So what do we want to regenerate here and how? And that's often a multi-stakeholder process with the local communities. And then you do the impact monitoring over time. And trust me, the technology is exponential. We're going to get much better at this. So if you're ready to start to baseline and set the goals now in 2-3 years, like what you know about the land you're operating in will be exponential. Climate and biodiversity. You were talking about this yesterday. There's this weird thing in the climate movement where it's like, we need to solve climate before we get to biodiversity, which is, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like there is no net zero without nature positive. It cannot happen, right? There's no climate without biodiversity because like the soil organisms, the trees, the ecosystems are the regulators of our planet's cycles. It's all the feedback loops, right? It's water cycles, it's peat bogs, it's forests. So we can't think of these as two separate things, and the climate movement for a long time has segregated them. And I think finally we're seeing them come together. So that for me is really critical and really important. And actually I was reading this article 2 days ago that was saying, solar panels are great, but they're not going to feed birds, they're not going to influence water cycles, they're not going to manage a watershed. For that you need trees. So this trade-off, right, is we have to think we can have a net zero world, but if there's no nature in it, I don't want to live in that world.